Graham Aldridge said it without thinking, which was the problem. He had spent the better part of 20 minutes walking the rows of Cora Dunbar's apple orchard in silence, one hand in his coat pocket, the other trailing along a branch heavy with Honeycrisp. The afternoon light in the Okanagan Valley was doing something absurd, turning everything gold. And Cora was 2 steps ahead of him, pulling a low-hanging apple from the branch and biting into it like she owned the place. Which she did. That was the whole problem. "If I were 20 years younger," Graham said, more to the orchard than to anyone, "I'd have stayed in a place like this instead of building on top of it." Cora stopped walking. "Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Do you believe that a man who has spent his whole life building things can ever truly learn to simply be somewhere? Tell me in the comments. Now, let's get back to the orchard." She turned slowly, the apple still in her hand, and looked at him with the kind of stillness that made Graham realize he'd said it out loud. "Pardon me," she said. Graham adjusted his collar. "Forget it, I was thinking out loud." "You weren't thinking," Cora said. "You were feeling something. There's a difference." Graham Aldridge was 42 years old. He had built Aldridge Developments from a single condominium project in North Vancouver into one of the largest real estate firms west of Toronto. He did not feel things out loud. He ran numbers. He closed deals. He had shown up to this orchard in the interior of British Columbia with a letter of offer worth $4 million and expected a handshake before dinner. What he had not expected was Cora Dunbar. She was 27, the granddaughter of the man who had planted these rows 40 years ago. She had a degree in agricultural science from UBC, mud on her boots, and absolutely no intention of selling. She had told him so at the door before he'd even taken off his jacket. She told him again over coffee, and now she was telling him a third time, in a different way, by looking at him like she could see straight through the offer and into whatever was behind it. "The orchard isn't for sale," she said. "You've come a long way for a no." "I've come a long way because every no has a number," Graham said, because that was what he always said. Cora bit into the apple again. "Not this one." That should have been the end of it. Graham was a practical man. He would drive back to Kelowna, send a follow-up letter through his firm's legal team, and wait. He had done it before. Stubborn sellers always came around eventually. Except he didn't leave that evening. His driver had already gone back to the city, and a slow roll of thunderclouds was gathering over the lake. Cora, without ceremony and without what Graham would describe as warmth, told him the spare room was ready if he needed it, and that she got up at 5:30. He stayed. He told himself it was practical. Over the following 2 days, Graham did something he hadn't done in years. He watched Cora move through the orchard in the early fog, checking irrigation lines, recording harvest data on a clipboard that looked older than her. He watched her talk to her part-time worker, a teenager named Marco, with the same direct patience she used on Graham himself. He watched her eat lunch, standing at the kitchen counter, and call it fine. On the second morning, he found a pair of work gloves and started clearing storm-dropped branches from the orchard path without being asked. Cora appeared beside him 20 minutes later and said nothing. She just picked up the other end of a heavy limb and helped him drag it to the fence line. "You're going to ruin those shoes," she said. "They're already ruined." "Good." There was almost a smile in it. That afternoon, a black SUV with city plates pulled into the drive. The man who stepped out introduced himself as a representative of Alderman Hugh Spratt, Kelowna's Planning Committee chair, and handed Cora a formal document without further explanation. She read the first paragraph. Her face went tight. The city was initiating a rezoning assessment of properties along the Lakeview Bench corridor. Her orchard fell within the boundary. 60 days to respond. After that, a committee vote. When the SUV left, Cora sat down on the porch step. Graham leaned against the railing and didn't try to say anything useful, which was new for him. "They've been trying to crack this corridor open for 5 years, she said finally. "The Lakeview Bench has the best growing soil in the valley. Rezone it, and every small orchard here is finished. The land goes to developers." She looked up at him. "People like you." "I didn't know about this assessment," Graham said. "I believe you," she said, then quieter. "I'm not sure why." What Graham found out the next morning made everything considerably worse. His firm had purchased a parcel adjacent to Cora's property, 3 years earlier through a subsidiary company. A long-term landhold, standard practice. He hadn't thought about it in months. But when he checked the boundaries against the rezoning notice, the city's red line ran directly through both properties. He told Cora at breakfast. She set down her mug. "So we're both in this." "Yes." She was quiet a moment. "And I'm supposed to trust you." "I'm not asking you to trust me," Graham said. "I'm asking you to work with me. There's a difference." He heard her own words coming back out of his mouth and didn't try to hide it. She almost smiled. "Fine, but I call a lawyer." The lawyer she called was Carson Beale, mid-30s, an agricultural land rights specialist from Penticton, who arrived the following afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and a command of the Agricultural Land Reserve Act that made Graham feel, briefly, like the least useful person in the room. Carson was easy with Cora in the way of someone who had known her a while. He made her laugh twice in the first 20 minutes. He called Alderman Spratt's office, a slow-motion land grab in a fleece vest, and she laughed a third time. Graham said very little. That evening he stood at the far end of the orchard and called Frank Whitbury, his oldest friend. "What's the problem?" Frank said. "No problem, updating you on a file." "Graham, what's the problem?" "There's a lawyer, he's good, and she, the landowner, she listens to him." Frank was quiet for a second. "Is that actually the problem?" Graham didn't answer. "How old is she?" "Irrelevant." "Right," Frank said, "so very relevant." Graham found something the following evening in Cora's barn. He was alone, going through cedar trunks of old property records, building the production history that Carson's case needed, when he turned up a yellowed envelope at the bottom of the last box. The handwriting on the front was careful, unhurried. It was addressed to Harold Dunbar, Cora's grandfather. Inside was a letter from Robert Aldridge, Graham's father. He sat down on an overturned crate and read it twice. The letter was dated 1987. His father, then a young developer just starting out in the valley, had written to Harold about a partnership they had evidently planned. Not a purchase, but a joint venture, 50 acres, fruit production. Something had fallen through. The final paragraph thanked Harold for his honesty and his handshake, and said that if things had gone differently, he would have been proud to build something alongside a man like him. Graham had never known his father to write letters like that. He was still sitting there when Cora came to find him an hour later. "I found something," he said, and handed it over. She read it standing. Then she sat down on the crate beside him. "My grandfather talked about your dad," she said quietly. "He said he was one of the only developers who ever treated him like an equal." "I didn't know him that way," Graham said. "I knew him as someone who taught me to close deals." Maybe that wasn't all he was. Graham looked at the letter. Maybe not. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The barn was still and cold, and smelled like sawdust and old wood, and somewhere in that silence, something shifted in Graham Aldridge that he wouldn't have been able to name yet. A week later, Carson found the flaw in the city's case. The environmental baseline study had been filed 6 months before the legally required agricultural production survey, a procedural violation that invalidated the rezoning application entirely, provided Cora could show continuous production records for the last 2 growing seasons. She could. She had clipboards full of them. "It buys us time," Carson said, spreading documents across the kitchen table. "Enough to challenge Spratt's process. If he rushed the assessment, he did it for a reason." "He did," said Graham. He set a folder between them. "My firm's legal team pulled the public record. Spratt's committee has approved 6 rezoning applications in the Lakeview corridor over 4 years. All of them are connected to the same numbered company. All of them sold below market within a year of rezoning." Carson picked up the folder. "Who owns the numbered company?" "We're close," Graham said. It took 4 more days. The trust's director was Spratt's brother-in-law. The scheme had been running quietly for 5 years, moving through the agricultural belt of the valley one small farm at a time, devaluing and rezoning and selling in a neat, unhurried loop. Carson brought the evidence package to the RCMP and the Provincial Agricultural Land Commission the same morning. By the following Tuesday, Spratt's files were under review. The rezoning assessments for the entire Lakeview Bench corridor were suspended pending investigation. Cora got the call while she was in the orchard. She stood in the row of Honeycrisp trees and cried, briefly, without apologizing for it. Graham was nearby. He didn't go to her immediately. But when she walked back toward the house and passed him, he reached out and stopped her with one hand on her arm. "It's not over," he said. She looked at him. "I know." She wasn't only talking about the orchard, and they both understood that. 2 days later, Carson arrived with a bunch of sunflowers from the market and set them on the counter like it was the most natural thing in the world. Cora laughed and put them in a jar and said, "Thank you." And Graham stood across the room with his coffee and said nothing at all, which was becoming a habit he was starting to resent in himself. That night he sat alone on the porch in the dark. He had a long, honest conversation with himself for the first time in years. He was 42. He had a company, a condo in Cole Harbor, and a long record of walking away from things before they could walk away from him. Cora was 27. She had an orchard and no interest in being purchased or impressed. And she had been looking at Carson Beale, the way you look at someone when you're trying to decide whether you feel something. Graham went inside and worked the numbered company problem until 2 in the morning. The Saturday after the investigation broke, Graham drove to the Kelowna Farmers Market. It was not a venue he had ever had occasion to visit professionally. He found Carson near the back of the pavilion first. This was not part of any plan. Carson turned when Graham approached, and there was a second where both of them understood exactly what this conversation was. "How is she?" Graham asked. Carson looked at him steadily. "You could ask her yourself." "I'm asking you." Carson set down the jar of preserves he was holding. "She's good. She works too early and stays up too late and pretends it's fine. And she talks about you more than she probably realizes." He paused. "For what it's worth." "Thank you," Graham said, and meant it. He found Cora at her table near the entrance, the season's early harvest arranged in front of her. She was mid-conversation with an older customer when she looked up and saw him, and for just a second her face did something she couldn't quite control. He walked straight to her table. When the customer moved on, he said, without preamble, "I withdrew the development application this morning." Cora blinked. "Graham." "The Lakeview parcel, my firm's subsidiary, the whole project." He said it the way he said everything, flat and straight. "It was never the right site. I knew that after the first day here. I kept the application open because I'm thorough, not because I wanted it." Around them, the market noise dimmed. A few people nearby had stopped pretending to browse. "You just withdrew a $4 million acquisition," Cora said. "I did. Because of an apple orchard. Because of the person running it." He held her gaze. "I'm not good at this. I'm aware of that. But I'm standing in a farmer's market on a Saturday morning because I'd rather be here than anywhere else I can think of, and I think you already know what that means." Several people were definitely listening now, with the specific, polite Canadian commitment to appearing not to listen. Cora looked down at the apples on her table, then at him. "You know," she said, "you could have said that at the orchard." "I know." Or on the phone. "I know." Or literally any time in the last 2 weeks. "Cora." She looked at him. "I'm asking for a chance," he said. "Not to buy anything, not to develop anything, just," he stopped, "just this." She picked up an apple from the table and held it out. He took it. "You can start," she said, "by helping me pack up at the end of the day." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The investigation into Alderman Hugh Spratt concluded 3 months later. The numbered company was dissolved, 6 rezoning approvals were rescinded, and the Agricultural Land Commission issued new long-term protections for the Lakeview Bench corridor. The Okanagan felt briefly famous, then quietly returned to itself. That fall, Cora's orchard had its strongest harvest in 6 years. She hired 2 full-time workers. Carson Beale's firm filed the final documentation to permanently register the Dunbar property under agricultural protection. And then Carson went back to Penticton and started seeing someone there, which Cora mentioned to Graham over the phone, with a lightness in her voice that told him more than she intended. At Christmas, Graham came back to Kelowna. He didn't bring a briefcase. He helped with the last of the season's clearing, learned which varieties bruised if you stacked them wrong, and ate dinner at Cora's kitchen table every night for 10 days straight. On the last evening before he was due to drive back to Vancouver, he stood in the orchard after dark and didn't move for a long time. Cora came out in her jacket and stood beside him. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Standing here deciding something and not saying it." He turned to look at her. The rows were bare in December, the cold coming off the lake, the sky low and gray-white the way it gets before snow. He said, "I want to be here, not to build here, not to own here. I want to wake up in a place that doesn't have to become something else." "That's not a question," Cora said. "No," he took her hand, "this is." He didn't have a ring because he hadn't planned this, which was, if he was being honest, the most honest thing about him. He said it simply, "Will you let me stay?" She was quiet a long moment. The orchard held its stillness around them. "You drove 4 hours on a Friday afternoon to stand in a farmer's market," she said. "I did." "You withdrew a $4 million deal." "I did." "You learned the difference between a Honeycrisp and a Spartan." "You made me take a quiz." She laughed, and then she said yes. He pulled her close in the dark between the bare trees, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because sometimes the only thing left after all the noise is the simple, solid fact of staying. Graham Aldridge had spent 20 years knowing the value of things. It took one autumn in the Okanagan to understand that the most valuable thing he'd ever found was the one he almost drove away from on a Tuesday afternoon in September. $4 million in hand, in shoes that were not made for mud. He never wore those shoes again.